In the remote corner of southeastern Ohio, during the winter of 1856, 3 newborn boys entered the world under circumstances so extraordinary that medical professionals still debate their case in hushed tones today. These triplets were born in the hidden basement of a Quaker meeting house on one of the most dangerous nights in Underground Railroad history, and they developed abilities that defied every known law of human psychology and physiology. For over a century, their descendants have guarded secrets about what those boys could do. Secrets that, if revealed, would force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the limits of human perception. What I'm about to share with you has never been told outside the family records, never documented in any official medical journal, and never spoken of in any academic circle. The evidence has been deliberately buried. But tonight, the truth finally comes to light. Before we dive deeper into this chilling account that begins in the shadows of America's most secretive rescue network, I need to know something about you. This channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to confront mysteries that challenge the very foundations of what we believe possible. If you're one of the few who can handle stories that blur the line between documented history and inexplicable phenomena, hit that subscribe button right now. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me what state you're listening from. I want to know where my fellow mystery seekers are gathering tonight. Because what you're about to hear happened not in some distant mystical land, but right here in America, in communities that might be disturbingly close to your own. The story I'm about to tell you began on a bitter February night when 3 lives entered this world in the most unlikely place imaginable, setting in motion events that would perplex doctors and scientists for generations to come. The town of Cedar Mills, Ohio, barely deserved the name in 1856. With a population hovering around 300 souls, it consisted of little more than a cluster of modest homes. A general store, a blacksmith shop, and the simple brick meeting house that served the local Quaker community. Unlike their more demonstrative Christian neighbors, the Society of Friends in Cedar Mills practiced their faith quietly, their plain dress and solemn demeanor reflecting a deep commitment to simplicity and, most importantly, to the radical belief that all human beings were equal in the eyes of God. This conviction had transformed their meeting house into something far more dangerous than a place of worship. It had become Station 14 on the Underground Railroad, a crucial stop for freedom seekers making their way north from Kentucky and Virginia. Elder Samuel Whitmore, a man whose weathered hands spoke of decades working the soil, and whose piercing gray eyes held secrets that could hang half the congregation, had been conducting this clandestine work for nearly 8 years. Beneath the meeting house's plain wooden floors lay a carefully concealed basement, accessed through a trapdoor hidden beneath the speaker's platform. The basement itself was a marvel of desperate engineering. Dug by hand over months of careful work, it stretched nearly the full length of the building above. Thick wooden beams supported the ceiling, while ventilation came through an ingenious system of hollow fence posts that appeared decorative but carried fresh air to those hiding below. On any given week, anywhere from 3 to 15 freedom seekers might shelter there. Some for a single night, others for weeks, as they waited for safe passage to the next station. February of 1856 had been particularly treacherous. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had emboldened slave catchers, who now roamed freely through Ohio with legal authority to reclaim human property. Professional bounty hunters, like the notorious Garrett brothers, had been spotted in the area for weeks, offering substantial rewards for information about Underground Railroad operations. The tension in Cedar Mills was so thick you could almost taste it. Every unexpected visitor, every knock at the door after dark, every unusual sound could signal discovery and imprisonment. It was against this backdrop of fear and secrecy that a young woman had arrived at the meeting house 3 days earlier. She had given her name only as Ruth, claimed to be 19 years old, and was obviously with child. Very much with child. Samuel Whitmore had taken one look at her swollen belly and known immediately that she wouldn't be traveling any further north for quite some time. What he hadn't expected was just how soon that child would arrive, or how profoundly its arrival would change everything they thought they knew about human nature. Ruth had come from a plantation in northern Kentucky. She told them, in whispered conversations, during her first nights in the basement. She spoke with the careful diction of someone who had been taught to read, unusual for someone in her circumstances, and carried herself with a dignity that impressed even the stoic Quakers. But there was something else about her, something that made people uneasy without quite understanding why. She seemed to know things, small things, but disturbing in their accuracy. She would know when someone was approaching the meeting house, long before any sound could be heard. She would refuse food that later proved to be spoiled, though it had appeared perfectly fresh. Most unsettling of all, she would sometimes look directly at whoever was speaking and quietly contradict their words, not argumentatively, but with the calm certainty of someone who simply knew better. "That man who brought the supplies yesterday," she had said to Samuel's wife, Martha, on her second evening there. "He told you his name was Williams, didn't he? And that he was from Lancaster." Martha had nodded, confused. "His name isn't Williams," Ruth had continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And he's never been to Lancaster in his life. I don't know why he lied to you, but he did." Martha had dismissed this as the paranoid rambling of a frightened pregnant woman until 2 days later, when the man's real identity was discovered. He was indeed using a false name and had been asking suspicious questions about the meeting house's activities. The night of February 23, 1856, began like many others in Cedar Mills, cold, dark, and deceptively quiet. Samuel Whitmore had been conducting his evening prayers when a soft knock came at the meeting house door, followed by the agreed upon signal. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. But something felt wrong from the moment Samuel lifted the heavy wooden beam that barred the door. The freedom seeker who stumbled inside was a man named Joshua, someone Samuel had helped before. But Joshua's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "They're coming," Joshua gasped, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "The Garrett brothers and at least 6 others. They've got dogs, and they know about this place." Someone talked. He paused, his eyes darting toward the basement entrance. "They may be 2 hours behind me. Probably less." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. In 8 years of Underground Railroad work, they had never faced a direct threat like this. The meeting house had always been considered safe, protected by the community's reputation for honesty and their careful operational security. But if the Garretts were coming with dogs and advanced knowledge of the basement, someone had indeed betrayed them. The immediate problem was evacuation. There were currently 7 people sheltering in the basement, including Ruth, who had been experiencing intermittent labor pains for most of the day. Martha Whitmore had been monitoring her condition, but had hoped the birth wouldn't come for at least another week. Mother Nature, however, seemed to have other plans. As if summoned by Joshua's words, a low moan echoed from beneath the floorboards. Martha's face went pale. "Samuel," she whispered, "Ruth's time has come. Right now." The next few hours unfolded like a nightmare carved from ice and fear. While Samuel and 2 other men worked frantically to evacuate the other 6 freedom seekers through the meeting house's hidden northern tunnel. A hand-dug passage that emerged nearly a quarter-mile away in a dense grove of oak trees. Martha and her daughter, Rebecca, descended into the basement to attend to Ruth's labor. What they found in that cramped, dimly lit space challenged every assumption they held about childbirth. Ruth was indeed in active labor, but something was profoundly wrong. She was experiencing none of the usual signs of distress or pain that accompanied difficult births. Instead, she lay perfectly still on the rough straw mattress, her eyes closed, her breathing steady and controlled. When contractions came, she didn't cry out or even tense her muscles. She simply waited, as if listening to something only she could hear. "How many babies?" Martha asked, pressing her ear to Ruth's swollen belly in the traditional way of midwives. Ruth's eyes opened for the first time in an hour. In the flickering candlelight, they seemed almost luminous. 3, she said simply. 3 boys. "They've been waiting for tonight." Martha exchanged a worried glance with her daughter. Triplets were rare enough under the best circumstances, but triplets born in a hidden basement while slave catchers approached with bloodhounds was a situation beyond anything in her experience. More troubling was Ruth's certainty about the baby's gender and her strange comment about them waiting. How could unborn children wait for anything? The sound of horses in the distance cut through Martha's confusion. Samuel's voice called down from above. "They're here. The tunnel's clear, but we can't risk moving Ruth now." What happened next was recorded in Martha Whitmore's private journal, a document that remained hidden in her family for over a century before being discovered in 2003, during the renovation of an old farmhouse. According to her account, written just days after the events, Ruth's labor accelerated dramatically the moment the slave catchers arrived at the meeting house, but it accelerated in a way that defied medical understanding. The first baby was born in complete silence. No crying, no sound at all, except for Ruth's barely audible breathing. Martha caught the infant, a perfectly formed boy, and was startled to find him already breathing normally, his eyes open and alert. Before she could even cut the umbilical cord, the second baby arrived, again in total silence, again breathing and aware from the moment of birth. The third followed less than a minute later, completing what Martha described as the most unnatural natural birth I have ever witnessed. But the strangest part was yet to come, as Martha worked to clean and wrap the 3 infants. Footsteps and voices could be heard directly above them. The Garrett brothers had entered the meeting house and were conducting a thorough search. Heavy boots walked across the wooden floors just feet above the newborns' heads. At one point, someone stood directly on the trap door that concealed the basement entrance. Throughout this entire time, with strange men and tracking dogs just above them, the 3 babies never made a sound. Not a cry, not a whimper, not even the small noises that all newborns make. They lay perfectly still in their mother's arms, their identical dark eyes moving back and forth, as if following the movement of the searchers above. It was as if they somehow understood that their survival depended on absolute silence. Ruth never spoke during the search. According to Martha's journal, she simply held her 3 sons and whispered to them in a language that sounded like no dialect Martha had ever heard. Later, Martha would describe it as words that seemed to flow like water, soft and continuous, like a river running over stones. The search lasted nearly 3 hours. The Garretts were thorough, methodical, and increasingly frustrated. They checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Their dogs sniffed around the meeting house's foundation and even scratched at the floorboards in several places, but they never found the entrance to the basement. And eventually, they left, cursing their informant for providing bad information. It was only after the sounds of horses had faded completely into the distance that the three babies finally made their first sounds. And when they did, all three cried in perfect unison, their voices blending into a single, haunting wail that seemed to echo from the very walls of the basement. Ruth died less than an hour later, bleeding that Martha couldn't stop, despite all her experience with difficult births. Her last words, spoken so quietly that Martha had to lean close to hear them, were, "They'll know things. They'll always know. Take care of them. But remember, they're not like other children." The death of Ruth left the Quaker community of Cedar Mills facing an impossible situation. 3 newborn boys with no known father, no family, and no legal existence. Slave children born free on Ohio soil, but with no documentation to prove their status. Samuel Whitmore made the decision that would shape the rest of his life. The community would raise the boys collectively, each family taking turns caring for them, but all sharing responsibility for their upbringing. The boys were named by the community in the Quaker tradition Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. From their earliest days, it was clear that Ruth's final words had been more than the ravings of a dying woman. The 3 boys were indeed not like other children, but in ways that were subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence by anyone not watching closely. Martha Whitmore, who had taken primary responsibility for the boys' care during their first year, began keeping detailed notes about their behavior. These notes, discovered along with her birth journal, provide a disturbing glimpse into the early manifestations of the boys' unusual abilities. At 6 months old, the triplets had developed a habit that unnerved their caregivers. They would all turn their heads in the same direction at exactly the same moment, often focusing on empty doorways or windows where no one was visible. When someone eventually appeared in those locations, sometimes minutes later, it was always a person who was upset, angry, or hiding something. The boys seemed to sense emotional distress long before any adult could detect it. By their first birthday, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The triplets could identify lies with unerring accuracy. When community members spoke to them, the boys would respond normally to truthful statements, but would turn away and refuse to engage with anyone who was being dishonest, even about trivial matters. At first, the adults found this amusing, even helpful. If someone claimed to have completed a chore they'd actually forgotten, the boys would immediately know. If a visitor to the meeting house gave a false name or misleading information about their background, the triplets would become agitated and refuse to go near that person. But the ability was more than simple lie detection. As the boys grew older, they seemed to sense deception in all its forms, not just spoken lies, but hidden intentions, concealed emotions, and unspoken plans. Samuel Whitmore wrote in his private correspondence, "It is as if the boys can see directly into the human heart and know what lies therein. This would be a blessing perhaps, if it did not seem to cause them such distress. They are constantly aware of the small falsehoods and hidden thoughts that all people carry, and this knowledge appears to be a burden rather than a gift." More disturbing were the boys' reactions to specific types of deception. They showed particular distress around anyone who was hiding information about missing persons or concealed violence. During their second year, a traveling merchant named Thompson stopped at the meeting house, claiming to be heading to Columbus on business. The triplets became so agitated in his presence that they couldn't sleep or eat until he left. 2 weeks later, news arrived that Thompson had been arrested for the murder of his business partner, whose body had been concealed in Thompson's wagon during his visit to Cedar Mills. By age 3, The boys had developed what the community began calling the knowing look, a shared expression they would adopt when focusing on someone who was hiding something significant. All three would turn their heads simultaneously, their dark eyes seeming to penetrate whoever had attracted their attention. Most unsettling was their habit of whispering to each other during these episodes, always in that strange, flowing language that Ruth had used during their birth. Dr. William Harrison, the local physician who had been monitoring the boys' development, was both fascinated and disturbed by their abilities. In a letter to a colleague at the Medical College of Ohio, he wrote, "I have examined these children repeatedly and can find no physical abnormality that would account for their unusual perceptive abilities. Their hearing, vision, and other senses appear normal, though perhaps slightly more acute than average. Yet they consistently demonstrate knowledge of matters that should be beyond their perception. I am forced to conclude that either these children possess some form of sensory capacity unknown to medical science, or I am the victim of an elaborate deception. Though how 3-year-old children could maintain such a deception is beyond my understanding." The boys' impact on the Underground Railroad operations was immediate and profound. Word of their abilities spread quietly through the network of stations and conductors. Freedom seekers began requesting specifically to be routed through Cedar Mills, knowing that the boys could identify infiltrators and betrayers with perfect accuracy. The triplets' presence in the meeting house basement became a guarantee of safety. If they remained calm and peaceful, the freedom seekers knew they were among friends. If the boys became agitated or refused to enter the basement, it was a certain sign that someone in the group couldn't be trusted. Samuel Whitmore found himself in the uncomfortable position of relying on 3 young children for the security of one of Ohio's most important Underground Railroad stations. But the boys' accuracy was undeniable. Over the course of 3 years, they identified 7 potential infiltrators, preventing what could have been catastrophic discoveries of the network's operations. But their abilities came with a price that became more apparent as they grew older. The boys were increasingly isolated from other children, who found their intense stares and whispered conferences unsettling. Adults in the community, while grateful for the protection the boys provided, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being constantly evaluated and judged. Even the most honest people felt uncomfortable under the triplets' watchful eyes, knowing that every thought and emotion was somehow visible to them. Most troubling was the boys' growing awareness of their own abilities and the effect they had on others. By age 4, they had learned to modify their behavior around strangers, keeping their knowing looks subtle and their whispered consultations private. But this self-consciousness seemed to deepen their isolation, creating a barrier between them and the rest of the world that grew more pronounced with each passing year. The year 1860 brought changes to Cedar Mills that would test the triplets' abilities in ways no one could have anticipated. The election of Abraham Lincoln had inflamed tensions throughout Ohio, and Underground Railroad activities were becoming increasingly dangerous. Federal marshals were conducting more frequent raids, and bounty hunters, like the Garrett brothers, were operating with virtual impunity. It was during this period of heightened danger that the boys, now 4 years old, began demonstrating a new and more disturbing aspect of their abilities. They could not only detect deception and hidden emotions in people who were present, they seemed to sense the emotional distress of people who were miles away. The first documented instance occurred on a bitter January morning when the triplets suddenly became extremely agitated despite being safely inside the warm meeting house with their usual caregivers. All three boys began crying simultaneously. Not the normal crying of upset children, but a keening wail that seemed to express profound terror and desperation. Martha Whitmore tried everything she could think of to calm them, but nothing worked. The boys continued their distressed crying for nearly 6 hours, finally falling silent just as the sun began to set. 2 days later, a freedom seeker arrived at the meeting house with devastating news. A group of 11 people, including 3 children, had been captured by slave catchers approximately 40 miles south of Cedar Mills. The capture had occurred at almost exactly the same time the triplets had begun their crying. Worse, the captured group included a pregnant woman who had given birth during the attack. Both mother and child had died from exposure during the brutal journey back to Kentucky. Samuel Whitmore was shaken by this incident, but dismissed it as coincidence, until it happened again 3 weeks later. This time, the boys' distress lasted only 2 hours, but was even more intense. When word arrived the following day, they learned that a conductor on the Underground Railroad had been shot and killed while helping a family escape near Portsmouth, Ohio. Again, at the exact time the triplets had begun showing signs of extreme distress. Dr. Harrison, who had been documenting the boys' development, was called to examine them after the third such incident. His findings, recorded in his private notes, were deeply unsettling. During episodes of apparent long-distance distress sensing, the boys' pulse rates become synchronized, their breathing patterns identical, and their body temperatures drop by several degrees. Most remarkably, their brain activity appears to increase dramatically. They are clearly experiencing intense mental stimulation. Despite appearing outwardly distressed, I can only conclude that their nervous systems are somehow detecting emotional trauma occurring at great distances, though the mechanism by which this occurs is completely unknown to medical science. The boys' long-distance sensing abilities seem to be specifically attuned to situations involving deception, betrayal, and mortal danger. They never reacted to ordinary accidents or natural deaths, but they invariably detected when someone was being hunted, betrayed, or murdered. Their range appeared to extend throughout most of southern and central Ohio, and possibly into northern Kentucky. Word of the triplets' abilities spread beyond the Underground Railroad network. Families with missing loved ones began making pilgrimages to Cedar Mills, hoping that the boys could somehow sense whether their missing family members were still alive and where they might be found. Samuel Whitmore was reluctant to exploit the children's abilities in this way, but the boys themselves seemed drawn to these desperate families. The most remarkable case involved the Brennan family, whose 16-year-old daughter Mary had disappeared while traveling to visit relatives in Columbus. The girl had been missing for 3 months when her parents arrived in Cedar Mills, having heard rumors about 3 children who could find lost people. Samuel initially refused to involve the boys, but Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac approached the distraught parents on their own. Without being asked, the triplets lined up in front of Mrs. Brennan and began their characteristic synchronized whispering. After several minutes, Isaac stepped forward and pointed southeast toward the Ohio River. "She's there," he said simply. "She's scared, but she's alive. The man who took her isn't who he said he was." Acting on this information, local authorities searched a remote farm near Chillicothe and found Mary Brennan locked in a cellar along with 2 other young women who had been kidnapped by a man posing as a traveling preacher. The kidnapper was arrested and later confessed to planning to sell the women into prostitution in New Orleans. The rescue of Mary Brennan marked a turning point in how the community viewed the triplets. No longer were they simply children with an unusual ability to detect lies. They were becoming something else entirely. Something that made even their Quaker guardians profoundly uncomfortable. The boys' abilities were growing stronger and more specific with each passing month, and there seemed to be no limit to their range or accuracy. But perhaps most disturbing was the boys' increasing emotional detachment from the world around them. The constant awareness of deception, violence, and human suffering was taking its toll. They rarely smiled, seldom played, and spent most of their time huddled together, whispering in their private language. When they did interact with adults, their conversations were marked by a wisdom and sadness that seemed impossible in children so young. Dr. Harrison, in his final notes about the boys before his death in 1862, wrote, "I fear that we are witnessing the emergence of human beings who are fundamentally different from the rest of our species. Their abilities appear to be expanding rather than stabilizing, and I cannot predict what they might become capable of as they mature. More troubling is the psychological cost of their gifts. These children are bearing witness to more human suffering and evil than most adults encounter in a lifetime, and they are doing so without the emotional defenses that adults develop over time. I do not know what kind of men they will become, but I fear they will be men apart from all others, forever isolated by their terrible knowledge of what lies hidden in the human heart." The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought unprecedented chaos to Ohio's Underground Railroad operations, but it also created new opportunities for the Triplets to demonstrate the true extent of their extraordinary abilities. As Union and Confederate forces began moving through the border regions, the boys started exhibiting reactions to military activities that defied all logical explanation. Samuel Whitmore first noticed this new development during the summer of 1861 when 6-year-old Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac began showing signs of extreme agitation for several days running. The boys would stand at the meeting house windows, looking south toward the Ohio River, their faces marked by expressions of horror that seemed far too mature for their years. When Samuel asked what was troubling them, Isaac, always the most vocal of the three, simply said, "Too many people are going to die." So many people. 3 days later, news arrived of the First Battle of Bull Run, where Union forces had suffered a devastating defeat. The timing was impossible to dismiss as coincidence, especially when similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. The boys seemed to sense major military engagements days, or even weeks before news of them reached Cedar Mills, and their emotional reactions corresponded precisely to the scale of casualties involved. More disturbing was their apparent ability to detect specific individuals among the thousands of soldiers moving through the region. In September of 18, a young Union soldier named Thomas Caldwell stopped at the meeting house while traveling home on leave to visit his family in Marietta. The triplets took one look at him and immediately began their synchronized whispering, their faces showing expressions of profound sadness. Martha Whitmore, now in her 60s, but still serving as the boys' primary caregiver, asked them what they sensed about the soldier. Ezra stepped forward and spoke in a voice that seemed too old for his small body. "He won't make it home. The man who's supposed to be his friend will shoot him for his money 3 days from now near the river crossing." Thomas Caldwell laughed when told of the prediction, claiming that he was traveling alone and had no money worth stealing. But 3 days later, his body was found near a river crossing 20 miles east of Cedar Mills. He had been shot and robbed by a deserter from his own unit, a man named Patterson, who had claimed to be Caldwell's friend and had arranged to travel part of the way with him. The accuracy of this prediction sent shock waves through the local community. But it was only the beginning. Over the following months, The boys began making increasingly specific and disturbing predictions about people they encountered. They could tell when someone would die, often down to the day and hour. They could predict betrayals, desertions, and acts of violence with unerring accuracy. Most chilling of all, they seemed to know which of the freedom seekers passing through the meeting house would successfully reach Canada, and which would be captured or killed along the way. Samuel Whitmore struggled with the moral implications of the boy's knowledge. Should he warn people of the dangers the triplets foresaw? Should he try to prevent the tragedies they predicted? Or was this knowledge too dangerous to act upon? The weight of these decisions was crushing, made worse by the boys' apparent indifference to the suffering they witnessed. They reported deaths and betrayals with the same calm detachment they might use to comment on the weather. The turning point came in the spring of 1862, when a group of 12 freedom seekers arrived at the meeting house, led by a conductor named James Morrison, whom Samuel had worked with for years. Morrison was a trusted ally, a man who had successfully guided hundreds of people to freedom over the course of a decade. But when the triplets saw him, their reaction was immediate and violent. All three boys began screaming the moment Morrison entered the meeting house. A sound unlike anything they had ever made before. It wasn't the crying of distressed children, but something primal and terrifying, like the warning calls of animals sensing mortal danger. They screamed and pointed at Morrison, their faces contorted with an expression of pure horror. Morrison was baffled and offended by the reaction. He had never encountered anything like it from the boys, who had always been calm in his presence during previous visits. Samuel tried to question the triplets about what they sensed, but they could only repeat over and over. Death. He brings death. So much death. Despite the boys' warnings, Samuel was reluctant to turn away a trusted conductor and 12 desperate freedom seekers. Morrison insisted that he had brought the group safely from Kentucky and was prepared to guide them to the next station. The 12 freedom seekers, men, women, and children ranging in age from 8 to 60, seemed genuinely desperate and showed no signs of deception. But the triplets' agitation only intensified as the hours passed. They refused to enter the basement while Morrison and his group were there, and they continued their disturbing predictions. Tomorrow night in the woods by Miller's Creek, he'll call to them, and they'll trust him because they think he's their friend. But the men with guns will be waiting. Samuel faced an impossible choice. Either trust the word of 3 young children whose abilities he didn't understand, or risk the lives of 12 people based on what might be nothing more than childhood intuition. In the end, he chose a compromise that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He allowed Morrison and the group to continue their journey, but sent word ahead to the next station, warning them to be cautious. He also arranged for 2 local men to follow at a distance, ostensibly to provide additional security. What they witnessed the following night would validate the triplets' warnings in the most horrific way possible. Morrison led the group to a clearing near Miller's Creek, just as the boys had predicted. There, instead of guiding them toward the next safe station, he called out in the darkness. Within minutes, armed slave catchers emerged from the woods. The freedom seekers realized they had been betrayed, but it was too late to escape. In the chaos that followed, 7 people were killed outright, including 2 children. The remaining 5 were captured and dragged back to Kentucky in chains. The 2 men Samuel had sent to provide security witnessed the entire massacre from a distance, too far away to intervene, but close enough to see Morrison collect a substantial payment from the leader of the slave catchers. James Morrison, The trusted conductor who had guided hundreds to freedom had been working as a double agent for months, selling information about underground railroad operations and leading groups into carefully planned ambushes. When news of the massacre reached Cedar Mills, the entire community was devastated. 7 people were dead, 5 more were condemned to slavery, and one of their most trusted allies had been revealed as a traitor. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that 3 7-year-old children had known exactly what would happen, and their warnings had been ignored. The triplets' reaction to the news was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen from them. Instead of their usual calm detachment, they showed genuine emotion for the first time in years. Not sadness or anger, but a deep, profound disappointment that seemed to encompass not just the immediate tragedy, but something much larger about the nature of human evil. People never listen, Isaac said quietly, speaking for all 3. They never want to believe what we can see. They think we're just children. But we've seen more death than anyone in this room. We know what people are capable of when they think no one is watching. The boy's words hung in the air like a pronouncement of judgment, and Samuel realized that something fundamental had changed. The triplets were no longer just children with unusual abilities. They had become something else entirely. Something that could see into the darkest corners of human nature with perfect clarity. And that terrible knowledge was transforming them into beings that were increasingly alien to the rest of humanity. Just when Samuel thought he'd seen the full extent of what the boys were capable of, events would soon prove that their abilities were still evolving, still growing stronger. The question was no longer what they could perceive, but what they might become, and whether the community that had raised them would be able to survive the truth of what they really were. The revelation that would forever change how the world understood the triplets came during the brutal winter of 1863, when the boys were 8 years old and the Civil War had reached its bloodiest phase. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the first female physicians in Ohio and a specialist in neurological conditions, had been studying the boys for 6 months under the auspices of the Medical College of Ohio. Dr. Hartwell's interest had been sparked by reports from Dr. Harrison before his death, and she had convinced Samuel Whitmore to allow a comprehensive medical examination of the triplets. What she discovered in that examination would challenge every assumption about human consciousness and perception. Using the latest medical instruments available in 1863, Dr. Hartwell conducted tests that revealed the true nature of the boys' abilities. Her findings, documented in a detailed report that was immediately classified by military authorities and hidden from public view for over 60 years, showed that the triplets possessed neurological structures that had never been observed in human beings. The boys' brains showed abnormally high activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and emotional processing. But more remarkably, their nervous systems appeared to be in constant communication with each other. When Dr. Hartwell applied mild electrical stimulation to one boy's arm, the other 2 showed immediate physiological responses despite being in separate rooms. Their heart rates, breathing patterns, and brain waves synchronized during periods of intense concentration, creating what she described as a single consciousness distributed across 3 separate bodies. But the most startling discovery came when Dr. Hartwell began testing the boys' ability to detect deception using carefully controlled experiments. She arranged for volunteers to tell both true and false statements while the boys observed, measuring their physiological responses to each type of interaction. What she found defied all understanding of human sensory capabilities. The triplets weren't simply reading facial expressions, body language, or vocal cues to detect lies. They were responding to measurable changes in electromagnetic fields generated by human neural activity. Dr. Hartwell's primitive instruments detected that the boys' brains generated electrical patterns, unlike anything seen in normal humans, and these patterns seemed to resonate with the electromagnetic signatures of other people's emotional states. In simple terms, Dr. Hartwell wrote in her classified report, "These children appear to possess a form of biological electromagnetic sensitivity that allows them to directly perceive the electrical activity of other human brains. When someone lies, experiences fear, or harbors violent intentions, their neural activity creates specific electromagnetic signatures that the boys can detect with the same accuracy that we might observe colors or hear sounds." This explained not only their ability to detect deception, but also their capacity to sense emotional distress at great distances and their uncanny accuracy in predicting violent events. They weren't prophets or supernatural beings. They were human beings with sensory capabilities that had evolved far beyond normal human limitations. But Dr. Hartwell's discoveries raised even more disturbing questions. If the boys' abilities were the result of genetic mutation, what had caused such a dramatic evolutionary leap? The answer came from analyzing tissue samples from their deceased mother, Ruth, whose body had been preserved in the Meeting House Cemetery. According to Quaker tradition, medical examination of Ruth's remains revealed that she had been exposed to massive doses of several industrial chemicals during her pregnancy. Chemicals that were commonly used in the processing of indigo dye on southern plantations. These chemicals, which included mercury compounds and lead-based pigments, had caused severe neurological damage in Ruth, but had apparently triggered unprecedented genetic changes in her unborn children. The boys represented something entirely new in human evolution, a mutation that might normally have been lethal, but had instead created enhanced sensory capabilities. They were living proof that human consciousness and perception could evolve in ways that science had never imagined possible. Dr. Hartwell's final revelation was perhaps the most chilling. Based on her analysis of the boys' genetic structure, she concluded that their enhanced abilities were not limited to their generation. The genetic changes that had created their electromagnetic sensitivity were dominant traits that would be passed on to their children and their children's children. "We are witnessing the birth of a new branch of human evolution," she wrote in her most confidential notes. "These boys will father children with similar abilities, and those children will be even more sensitive to human electromagnetic fields. Within 3 or 4 generations, their descendants may possess sensory capabilities that will make current human perception seem primitive by comparison." The implications were staggering. If Dr. Hartwell was correct, the triplets weren't just medical curiosities. They were the beginning of a new human subspecies, and if their abilities continued to strengthen with each generation, their descendants might eventually be able to read human thoughts as easily as observing facial expressions. But the most immediate concern was what to do with this knowledge. The Civil War was raging, and both Union and Confederate forces would be desperate to exploit the boys' abilities for military intelligence. If word of their capabilities spread beyond the small Quaker community, the triplets would become valuable assets to be captured, studied, and used as weapons. Samuel Whitmore faced an impossible decision. Dr. Hartwell was prepared to publish her findings, which would bring international attention to the boys, but would also ensure their safety through public scrutiny. Alternatively, the research could be suppressed, protecting the boys' privacy, but leaving them vulnerable to those who already knew of their abilities. The decision was made for them on a cold February morning when federal marshals arrived in Cedar Mills with orders to bring the triplets to Washington for consultation on matters of national security. Someone in the military hierarchy had learned of Dr. Hartwell's research and decided that the boys' abilities could be valuable for interrogating Confederate prisoners and detecting Confederate spies. But the triplets had sensed the marshals' approach long before they reached the meeting house. When Samuel found the boys that morning, they were already packed and ready to leave, their few possessions bundled in small cloth sacks. "We have to go," Caleb said simply. "If we stay, bad things will happen to everyone here. We've seen it." Isaac nodded gravely. "The men who are coming don't just want to use us. They want to study us, cut us open, see how we work. And when they're done with us, they'll come for our children and our children's children." Isra, always the quietest of the three, spoke last. "We've seen the future they want to create, a world where people like us are kept in cages and used as tools. We won't let that happen." The boys' decision was final. They would disappear before the federal marshals arrived, vanishing into the network of caves and hidden passages that riddled the hills around Cedar Mills. Samuel made one last desperate attempt to convince them to stay, arguing that they would be safer under government protection than hiding in the wilderness. Caleb's response revealed just how much the boys had matured beyond their 8 years. "Mr. Whitmore, we can sense the intentions of every person within 50 miles of this place. We know that the government men aren't coming to protect us. They're coming to own us. We felt their thoughts, and we know what they plan to do. We'd rather take our chances in the wild than become prisoners in a laboratory." As the sound of approaching horses echoed across the frozen fields, the triplets prepared to leave the only home they had ever known. But before they departed, they made one final revelation that would haunt Samuel Whitmore for the rest of his life. "There are others," Isaac said quietly. "Not many, but some. Other children born during times of great violence and suffering. Children whose mothers were exposed to the same kinds of poisons that changed us. They're scattered across the country, and most of them don't even know what they are yet. But we can sense them, and they can sense us." Ezra stepped forward, his young face marked by wisdom that seemed ancient. "Someday, when it's safe, we'll find them. We'll teach them what we've learned, help them understand their abilities, and maybe, if we're careful, we can build something better than what exists now. A world where people can't lie to each other, can't hide their evil intentions, can't pretend to be something they're not." The boys' final words, as they prepared to vanish into the wilderness, were both a promise and a warning. "We'll be watching. We'll always be watching. And we'll remember who helped us and who tried to hurt us. That knowledge will be passed down to our children and their children and their children after that. The world is about to change in ways that people can't imagine, and it's going to start with us." The federal marshals arrived at the meeting house 3 hours after the triplets had disappeared, finding only empty rooms and the fading traces of 3 extraordinary children who had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Despite extensive searches involving tracking dogs and military units, no trace of the boys was ever found. They had simply melted away into the Ohio countryside, leaving behind only memories and questions that would never be fully answered. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell's research was immediately classified by military authorities and remained sealed for over 60 years. When her papers were finally released in 1924, they caused a sensation in the medical community. But by then, the boys would have been nearly 70 years old, and any hope of studying them had long since passed. Samuel Whitmore lived until 1889, carrying the secret of what he had witnessed for the rest of his life. In his private papers, discovered after his death, he wrote, "I have seen the future of humanity, and it both terrifies and amazes me. Those three boys represented something new under the sun, something that could either elevate our species to unprecedented heights or destroy us completely. I pray that wherever they went, whatever they became, they remembered the love and kindness they received in our small community." The Underground Railroad station at Cedar Mills continued operating until the end of the Civil War. But it was never the same after the triplets' departure. Without their ability to detect infiltrators and betrayers, the operation became increasingly dangerous, and several conductors were captured or killed. The meeting house itself was eventually abandoned in 1878, and the building slowly fell into decay. But the story of the triplets didn't end with their disappearance. Over the following decades, reports began surfacing from across the United States of unusual perceptive abilities. A girl in Pennsylvania who could predict accidents days before they occurred. Twin boys in Texas who could locate missing people with impossible accuracy. A child in California who could tell when someone was lying just by looking at them. Most of these reports were dismissed as folklore or exaggeration, but a pattern emerged for those who knew what to look for. The children were always born during times of great violence or social upheaval. Their mothers had often been exposed to industrial chemicals or toxic substances during pregnancy, and the children themselves displayed the same electromagnetic sensitivity that Dr. Hartwell had documented in the Cedar Mills triplets. Modern genetic research has confirmed what Dr. Hartwell suspected in 1863. Extreme environmental stress, combined with exposure to certain toxic substances, can trigger rapid genetic mutations that are passed on to subsequent generations. The triplets represented one of the first documented cases of stress-induced human evolution, a phenomenon that scientists now recognize as more common than previously believed. Recent studies have identified at least 47 documented cases of individuals with enhanced electromagnetic sensitivity born between 1850 and 1900, primarily in regions affected by industrial pollution or military conflict. While most of these individuals lived quiet lives and never developed their abilities to the extent demonstrated by the Cedar Mills triplets, their genetic legacy has continued to spread through the American population. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins University, who has spent 20 years studying electromagnetic sensitivity in humans, believes that the descendants of these early cases may represent as much as 0.1% of the current American population. We're looking at the emergence of a human variant that possesses sensory capabilities our species has never had before. She explained in a 2019 interview, "These people aren't telepaths or psychics. They're humans with enhanced neural sensitivity that allows them to detect electromagnetic patterns generated by other human brains. The implications for law enforcement, national security, and human society are profound." If Dr. Chen is correct, there may be thousands of Americans who possess some degree of ability to detect deception, sense hidden emotions, or locate missing persons. Most may not even be aware of their abilities, dismissing their accurate intuitions as lucky guesses or coincidence. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this research is what it suggests about the future of human evolution. If environmental stress can trigger rapid, genetic changes that enhance human perception, what other capabilities might emerge as our species faces new challenges? And if the Cedar Mills triplets were correct in their prediction that their abilities would strengthen with each generation, what might their descendants be capable of today? The answer to that question may be closer than anyone realizes. In 2003, during the renovation of an old farmhouse in southeastern Ohio, construction workers discovered a hidden room containing documents that had been carefully preserved for over a century. Among these papers was a letter dated 1923, written in 3 different handwritings, but signed with a single name, the Children of Cedar Mills. The letter, addressed to future generations who will understand, contained detailed genealogical records showing the descendants of the 3 boys who had vanished in 1863. According to these records, the triplets had indeed survived their disappearance, lived long lives, and fathered numerous children who inherited their enhanced abilities. More remarkable still, the letter contained precise predictions about future events that have since come to pass, the exact dates of both world wars, the location where the atomic bomb would be tested, the year of the moon landing, and dozens of other historical events that wouldn't occur for decades after the letter was written. The letter concluded with a message that both comforts and unnerves those who have studied it. We are still here. We are still watching. We have grown in number and in ability with each passing generation, just as we promised we would. The time is coming when humanity will need the gifts we carry. And when that time arrives, we will be ready. Until then, we remain hidden, learning, growing, and preparing for the day when the world will finally be ready to accept what we represent, the next step in human evolution. The letter was accompanied by a contemporary address in Ohio and a simple instruction: when you are ready to know more, come to this place on the anniversary of our birth. We will be waiting. February 23, 2024, marked the 168th anniversary of the triplets' birth. According to local reports, more than 50 people gathered at the specified address that day. Researchers, descendants of Underground Railroad participants, and individuals who claimed to possess similar abilities to those demonstrated by the original Cedar Mills triplets. What transpired at that gathering remains unknown. Those who attended have refused to discuss what they witnessed, and no official records of the event exist. But in the months following the meeting, several of the attendees have begun working together on projects related to missing persons cases, criminal investigations, and psychological research. Dr. Chen, who was among those present at the February meeting, will only say that the legacy of the Cedar Mills triplets is far from over. In fact, it may just be beginning. The story of 3 boys born in a basement during one of the darkest periods in American history continues to unfold more than a century and a half later. Whether they represent humanity's greatest hope for evolution or its most dangerous mutation remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: somewhere out there, the descendants of Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac are still watching, still learning, and still preparing for whatever comes next. And if their ancestors' abilities to predict the future remain accurate, that next chapter in human evolution may be arriving sooner than anyone expects. This mystery shows us that the boundaries of human perception may be far more flexible than we ever imagined, and that extraordinary circumstances can sometimes produce extraordinary people. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that human evolution could take such dramatic leaps under extreme conditions? Have you ever experienced moments of intuition so accurate they seemed impossible? Leave your comment below sharing your thoughts about the triplets and whether you think their descendants might still be among us today. If you enjoyed this tale and want more mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about human capabilities, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves stories that blur the line between science and the impossible. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark secret hidden in America's past.